Okay, so President Trump there speaking in Miami this afternoon, doubling down on some of the comments he made in that post on Truth Social this morning. But now some in his own party, especially on Capitol Hill, Republican members of the House and the Senate are strongly disagreeing with President Trump's assertions there. Live picture at the U.S. Capitol in Washington. And now some of those very senators who disagree with the president are back channeling with Zelenskyy himself. Zelenskyy posting this today, saying, I spoke with U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, saying we greatly appreciate the bicameral and bipartisan support of the U.S. Congress to the Ukrainian people in our fight against the Russian aggression. He says, as always, Senator Graham is constructive and doing a lot to help bring peace closer. It's all important that security guarantees remain on the table and that they work for Ukraine for real and lasting peace. He says, thank you for your support. In the meantime here, we want to talk about this even further. I have some questions now as, of course, we approach the 3-year mark since Russia launched the full-scale invasion. I want to bring into the conversation right now our friend there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Ivana Stradner. She joins me. Ivana, good to see you here. And I just want to first get your reaction to what you just heard President Trump say there in Miami, and we can break down some of the assertions that are roundly being described as false by supporters of the Ukrainian effort to fight back against Russian aggression. What did you make of the overall sentiment of the comments there? Is it helpful to have the leader of the free world, President Trump, who's trying to broker, in his words, an end to this war, and one of the combatants in the war, the leaders of one of the combatants in this very, very fight, arguing so publicly? Is that helpful for these talks or no?
I definitely think that this is not very helpful because this is truly a dream come true for Moscow, who is definitely benefiting from this. And while I firmly agree with President Trump that this is a devastating war and that many people are dying, I think one thing that we have to really think about is how actually Putin thinks about negotiations. And while he has expressed his readiness to talk, we must not be fooled, because Moscow actually just views these potential negotiations just as a way to achieve, its long-standing objective of subjugating Ukraine, but also to undermine the West. Putin does not care about reaching a genuine compromise. He actually needs the ceasefire as a break to rebuild his military, to reposition it, and then to continue his fighting. And Putin perfectly understands that President Trump wants to be perceived as a deal broker who can, unlike President Biden, create peace through strength. And he is not opposed, to giving Trump that gift of freezing the conflict. On the contrary, he's more than happy to do that, because make no mistake, this war is not going to end and stop at Ukraine. So any ceasefire may just be another interlude, before another war. Let's not forget, that Putin is a KGB training operative. He thinks in zero-sum game. We think in a very little different way. We love to talk economy, we love to talk business, and that's precisely why Trump is thinking already about certain aspects of cooperation with Russia. And Putin is using that basically to manipulate Washington. He has very, very different goals. And I have to tell you, since I moved to Washington, D.C., one thing that I learned is that policymakers here are often thinking about the world through their lenses. Putin does not think like us. He does not process information like us. He has very different goals. And make no mistake, there are already numerous reports coming from the Baltic states that fear that Putin might actually attack another NATO member state. And I understand that some people can think about Russia, that it's a third world dictatorship with nukes. All Putin really has to do is to organize chaos in one of those countries, send, peacekeepers, and to make sure that we are not going to respond. And that's precisely why the Trump administration, while he's negotiating with Putin, he really has to think about long-term goals, not short-term ceasefire, because it's in Putin's objective that he needs actually some pause.
So, Ivana, I wanted to ask, if you're Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz or Steve Witkoff, and you're sitting across the table from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he is voicing vis-a-vis through Putin, and he is Putin's representative here, there in Riyadh. How do you know, if you're Rubio, that Putin's not bluffing, that Putin's pretending, that Putin is just telling the Americans what they want to hear, because it's going over in Russia pretty well, I might add, some of the comments that President Trump has made in the last 48 hours. I want to put this up. This is from Dmitry Medvedev. He was the former Russian prime minister. He's in the Duma, I believe, right now, currently. He says this: a dictator without elections, Zelenskyy better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. He's quoting Trump. Medvedev says, if you told me just 3 months ago that these were the words of the U.S. president, I would have laughed out loud. Real Donald Trump is 200% right. Bankrupt clown. Medvedev calling Zelenskyy that here. Now, if those in the halls of the Kremlin are agreeing with the rhetoric of President Trump, does that bode well for Ukraine?
So one thing that we have to really understand that Putin has a long history of violating agreements. We tried reset with Russia multiple times and it didn't work. It didn't work multiple times over the past several decades because strategic deception is a cornerstone of how Russia operates. And they understand very well how to use exactly those statements to play into Trump's ego, because that's what everyone wants to hear. So as I mentioned, Putin is not militarily in a position to continue this war easily, and that's precisely why he needs this ceasefire. So we are doing him a favor, not vice versa. And after all, if we want to have a negotiations with Russia, Russia is more than welcome just to pack their stuff and leave Ukraine. So that's why, we have to be very, very careful how we approach. And when you ask me if I were in the office with Mark Rubio or Waltz, we really have to understand how perception management operates and to understand the culture and how they process information. So, of course, that Putin is bluffing because he has maximalist goals. He already multiple times emphasized that he wants to replace American-led world order with a multipolar one. He wants to undermine NATO and he wants to subjugate Ukraine. So he's not in a rush. We think in 4-year election cycle, Putin has a long path in front of him. And even after Putin, there are other people who can accomplish those objectives to restore what they like to call Russian greatness.
So, Ivana, one of the assertions that Trump is making for the rationale of why he's calling Zelenskyy a dictator is that Ukraine has not had an election, a countrywide election, since 2019. Obviously, the full-scale invasion happened in 2022. Why have they not had an election since then?
In Ukraine, you have martial law. And it is impossible, really, to have elections right now. And if you understand how the constitution operates there, it is absolutely understandable why they are not having elections. And also, President Trump cited very low approval rate of Zelenskyy. There are multiple reports actually saying that Zelenskyy approval is quite high. And after all, it's not Ukraine, but Russia does not have real elections. And we saw that multiple times.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the approval rating or lack thereof that Trump cited. He kind of made this number up. He said 4%. And obviously, it's very hard to conduct public polling for a population that is in wartime and under martial law. But I want to talk about some of the approval for the war in Ukraine and U.S. support for it here in the United States and how it has shifted since the full-scale invasion began back in 2022. So voters, this was from January. This is a Fox News poll from last month. Voters giving Ukraine 42%. That's a 1-point edge over Russia, 41%, when asked who is winning the war. So a 1-point difference on that very question. That's down from a 10-point edge back in May of 2023 and a 17-point edge back in January of 2023. Now, with all this going on, for those back in Ukraine who hear the U.S. president saying this, who hear our conversation right now, and I'm citing some of this polling about whether or not Americans think Ukraine can actually win this war, how concerned are they? And how concerned are they that Ukraine wasn't at the table in Riyadh? You know, even though you heard there President Trump saying, well, they could have gone, they weren't invited, but they could have been there at the table. That's, I'm paraphrasing. But what do they think about that?
So definitely people in Ukraine are concerned about how the West is going to continue to support Ukraine. And one thing that the Trump administration is also accurate is that we also need more Europe support over there. So, but it is impossible to help Ukraine without also the U.S. support. And look, we are not also some here idealistic people who just want to help for the sake of helping. We have to understand that it's strategically important for American national security to help Ukraine. After all, we declare here China as one of the greatest, threats to American national security. And China is watching. China is exactly watching how we are trying to appease Putin. So they can also test our red lines. Second thing, as I mentioned, Putin understands only one language, which is the language of power. Kindness is weakness for him. And that's precisely why he's not going to stop at Ukraine. He's already doing multiple sabotage activities in the West, multiple intelligence reports. He is already at war with the West, which is a hybrid war right below the threshold of war. And he's not going to stop there because the U.S. is an enemy for Russia.
Lastly, I want to talk about the money and the support the United States has provided. In that very Truth Social post that President Trump made, he said this: the United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back here. And he said this: we have a big, beautiful ocean as a separation. On top of this, Zelenskyy admits half of the money we send him is missing. And, it is right for the American public, the American people, to want to know where this money went, how it was spent, and the like here. But did Zelenskyy say that half of that money has gone missing?
I've not seen the reporting. I mean, look, Ukraine indeed, just like any other country, has an issue with corruption. They have done multiple efforts in the right direction to go after people who are exploiting Western support and doing things illegally. However, I want to emphasize one immensely important thing. This is not the waste of our money, because, as I mentioned, it is truly in American national interest to help Ukraine, because China is watching, and destabilized Europe, it also means destabilized the rest of Western economies. And the third point that I also want to emphasize is that Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine. Just look what's happening right now in Georgia. Putin already has threatened his neighboring states. He's trying to destabilize Moldova, and I can go on and on across Europe. That Europe is becoming more destabilized. However, it is also tremendously important that Europe wakes up to Russia's threat and double down its effort and to truly help Ukraine this time.
So just lastly, and this is somewhat of an open-ended question here, but that's where President Trump's language is going. And I'm going to pose the question to you. How do you convince the American people that it is in the United States' interest to keep supporting Ukraine? What's the argument?
So number one argument is that even though that sounds like a lot of money that we are sending to Ukraine, it's actually just a fracture of our money that we have for defense that actually really helps keep America first and America safe. And after all, as I mentioned, China is watching. So if we do not actually help Ukraine, China might also test our red lines with Taiwan. So make no mistake, this is one of the best investments that America can do for our national security.
All right, Ivana Stradner there with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Ivana, good to see you. We'll talk soon.